The moment my husband left for his business trip, a sense of quiet descended on our home. I stood at the door, watching him load his suitcase into the car, feeling a slight pang in my chest. We had said our goodbyes, and I had assured him that everything would be fine. But as soon as he pulled away, I was left alone with my thoughts, the silence in the house amplifying the emptiness. There was a strange mixture of relief and longing as I walked back inside, looking around at the rooms that once felt full of life. Now they seemed hollow. My husband and I had been married for 5 years. We had a comfortable life, one built on mutual respect and love. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't that we fought or had problems. It was more about the subtle emotional distance that had started to creep in. We didn't talk as much as we used to. He was busy with work, and I had my own things to occupy my time, but those silences between us had grown more pronounced over time. The nights felt longer without him beside me, and it was easy to let my mind wander to places it shouldn't. I sat on the couch, trying to find something to distract me. But even as I flicked through channels, the thought of my husband's best friend, Jake, kept creeping in. He had been part of our lives for years, and though we shared an easy camaraderie, there was always something more between us. Jake and I had a connection that neither of us fully understood. He was the kind of person who could make me laugh at my worst moments, someone who knew exactly what I needed without having to ask. And when my husband wasn't around, that connection always felt more intense, like a thread pulling us closer. Jake wasn't just my husband's best friend. He was like family. Growing up, they had been inseparable. They'd gone through everything together, school, relationships, and now adulthood. I had always admired their friendship, but lately, it had felt like I was the third wheel, like I didn't belong in their dynamic. When my husband was home, everything felt normal, but in his absence, Jake seemed to occupy the space he left behind. That night, when Jake texted to ask how I was doing, I couldn't help but feel a flutter in my chest. It was innocent enough, just a friendly check-in. But I found myself smiling at the screen longer than I should have. "Everything's fine," I texted back, trying to keep it light. "Just a little quiet here without husband's name. How are you?" His response was quick. "Same here. I know he's on business, but if you need company, just let me know. I'm only a few minutes away." I paused before responding, unsure of what to say. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy Jake's company, but I hadn't expected him to offer to come over so soon. We were always close, but this felt different. The line between friendship and something more seemed to blur, and I was unsure where to draw it. But loneliness has a way of clouding judgment, and in that moment, I realized how much I craved human interaction. More than just a friend, more than just casual company. I craved connection. I eventually agreed. "Sure, come by. I could use some company." Jake showed up an hour later with a bottle of wine, as though he knew exactly what I needed. We sat in the living room, catching up on everything, my husband's work, his latest projects, and the usual banter we always shared. The conversation was light at first, with laughter filling the spaces between us. But there was a subtle shift as the evening wore on. The jokes stopped coming as easily, and the silences between us started to feel heavier. Jake poured more wine, and I found myself sipping it slowly, trying to mask the strange feeling growing inside me. I felt comfortable with him, more than I had felt in a long time, but there was something else, something I couldn't explain, that felt like it was pulling me toward him. I tried to ignore it, but it lingered. The air between us felt different, charged even. Jake's presence was comforting in a way, but it was also unsettling. As the night went on, we found ourselves sitting closer on the couch. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, his scent mixing with the wine in the air. I told myself it was nothing. We were friends, nothing more. But my mind was betraying me, imagining all the things I had never allowed myself to consider before. The moment came unexpectedly. One minute, Jake was laughing at something I said, and the next his gaze had shifted. It wasn't just a glance. His eyes lingered on mine in a way that made my breath catch. He reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, and I felt an undeniable spark. I couldn't pull away. And that moment of hesitation, that single moment when everything could have stopped, didn't. I couldn't stop it, and neither could he. His touch lingered for a second too long, and suddenly, I was acutely aware of the way his hand rested on my arm. The touch, so simple, but so much more than I had ever expected. I knew I should pull away. I knew I should say something, anything, to stop this from happening. But the words didn't come. Instead, I felt a pull, a magnetic force that I couldn't explain. The connection between us, which had always been there in small doses, was now amplified. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It felt wrong, but in that moment it also felt right. The line between right and wrong blurred completely. Jake's eyes met mine, searching, and I saw something in them, something I couldn't ignore. His lips were so close to mine, and I found myself leaning in without thinking. When our lips met, it was soft, tentative, as though neither of us knew exactly what we were doing. But the moment it happened, I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to stop it. For a brief moment, everything else ceased to matter. The guilt, the consequences, none of it existed. It was just the two of us, wrapped in something unspoken, something that felt like it had always been waiting to happen. But then, as the kiss deepened, I pulled away, suddenly aware of what I had just done. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with disbelief. What had just happened? I couldn't undo it now. There was no going back. I pulled away from Jake, my heart pounding, a wave of guilt washing over me immediately. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I sat there, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. Jake seemed to sense my unease, and for a second, neither of us moved. His gaze lingered on me, searching, waiting for some kind of reaction. I could feel the heat from his body, but it only made me feel more exposed. "I'm sorry," he muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it didn't bring the comfort I needed. It only added to the heaviness in the room. I didn't mean for that to happen. His words were laced with uncertainty, as if he, too, was trying to process the moment. But the weight of it all hung in the air, thick and undeniable. I nodded slowly, unable to find my voice at first. My body felt numb, my heart still racing in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to make sense of the situation, but nothing seemed right. The reality of what we had just done was too overwhelming. My thoughts were scattered, like a storm had just torn through my mind. This was a mistake. A huge, irreparable mistake. "You should probably go," I managed to say, my voice sounding weak, distant, even to my own ears. The words felt like they were choking me. The days following that night were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that hung over me like a dark cloud, always present, never giving me a moment's peace. Every glance at my husband felt like a betrayal, every touch like an echo of what I had done. I kept telling myself that I would somehow make it right, that I would figure out a way to patch up the hole I had ripped in our relationship. But deep down, I knew there was no easy fix. The damage was done, and no amount of pretending could make it go away. Jake had texted me a few times, checking in, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't face him either. The thought of seeing him again filled me with dread. I wanted to pretend like nothing had happened, to pretend that everything was the same, but it wasn't. I couldn't even look at him the same way anymore. The space between us had shifted, and I didn't know how to close the gap. I wondered if he was feeling as conflicted as I was, or if he had already moved on, pushing the whole thing to the back of his mind. He never mentioned it again. But I couldn't forget. Each time my phone buzzed with a message, I would hold my breath for a moment, expecting it to be my husband. But when it wasn't him, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I couldn't bear to tell him the truth, and yet, every moment I avoided it felt like another lie piling up between us. I couldn't understand why I hadn't confessed yet. Maybe it was because I feared the consequences, or maybe because I wasn't ready to face the guilt that would come with seeing the hurt in his eyes. I tried to keep things normal between us, but it was impossible. Every conversation felt hollow. My husband seemed distracted, and I couldn't tell if it was just his usual stress from work or if he sensed something was wrong. He would ask how I was doing, and I would tell him everything was fine, even though it couldn't have been further from the truth. I could feel the distance growing between us, and with every passing day, the weight of my secret became harder to carry. Jake's silence weighed heavily on me. I couldn't bring myself to initiate a conversation with him, and he seemed to respect my space, though I knew he was probably just as uncomfortable as I was. But when he did text, his messages were casual, like nothing had changed. I couldn't understand how he could act so normal, so unaffected by what had happened. It made me feel even worse, like I was the only one who truly understood the gravity of the situation. One afternoon, I ran into him at the grocery store. I had been trying to avoid him, but fate had other plans. Our eyes met from across the aisle, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around and walking away. But there was no escaping it now. He approached me, his smile just a little too forced, his posture slightly stiff. The tension was palpable. Neither of us knew how to begin, how to address the elephant in the room. "Hey," he said, his voice awkward. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, just picking up a few things," I replied, my voice strained, not knowing what else to say. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, the anxiety creeping up my throat. It was like we were both walking on eggshells, afraid to speak, afraid to bring up what we both knew was unspoken. I think we need to talk," Jake said after a long pause, his words coming out in a rush. "About what happened?" I froze. It felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I hadn't been ready for this conversation, not yet. "Jake, I don't know if we should." "No, we have to," he interrupted, his expression serious. "We can't just pretend like nothing happened. It's too big to ignore." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "I know," I whispered, my throat tight. "But I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do." He stared at me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "We've both made a mess of things," he said quietly. "But we can't just pretend like everything's fine. It's not. It never will be if we keep ignoring it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been trying so hard to push it all aside, to avoid confronting what I had done. But here it was, staring me in the face. The truth. The undeniable reality that I couldn't escape. "I know," I said again, the weight of my guilt crushing me. "I've been trying to pretend that it didn't happen. But it did. And now I don't know what to do." Jake looked away for a moment, as if he were considering something. Then he turned back to me, his eyes softening slightly. "I don't know either," he admitted. "But we can't just leave it like this. We need to figure out what comes next." I nodded, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. What had come next? What was I supposed to do now? I wanted to fix everything, to take back what I had done, but I knew I couldn't. The damage was done, and now, all I could do was face the consequences. But could I really live with the guilt? Could I live with the knowledge that I had betrayed my husband, the person who had trusted me more than anyone else? The rest of the conversation was a blur. We talked briefly, but there was no real resolution. I didn't know what I expected from Jake, but nothing felt right. The weight of the secret still pressed down on me, suffocating me with every passing second. I knew that sooner or later, my husband would find out, and when that happened, there would be no going back. And I had no idea how to face him when the time came. I left the store with my hands trembling, my heart racing, but the one thing I was certain of was that the truth couldn't be avoided forever. It was only a matter of time before it would all come crashing down. And when it did, I would have to deal with the consequences, no matter how much I dreaded them. The days that followed were a blur of tension and guilt. My mind was constantly torn between what I had done and the life I had built. Every time my husband came home, I put on a mask, pretending everything was fine, but it felt like I was living in a constant state of fear, as if the truth was going to spill out at any moment. The guilt gnawed at me relentlessly, a constant presence that I couldn't escape. It was as if I was suffocating, drowning in the weight of my secret. I couldn't look at my husband without seeing the lie in my eyes. I couldn't even hold his hand without feeling the disconnect that now existed between us. It was as if everything had changed overnight, and no matter how hard I tried to deny it, nothing would ever be the same. Jake and I had been careful since our encounter. We didn't speak much after that awkward confrontation at the grocery store. He had sent me a couple of messages, but I ignored them, unsure of how to navigate this new, strange dynamic between us. I was terrified of what would happen if we crossed paths again. I couldn't allow myself to be alone with him. The thought of seeing him again filled me with dread and desire in equal measure. The connection we had shared felt too intense, too dangerous, and I couldn't allow myself to go down that road again. But despite my attempts to keep my distance, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every moment I was alone, my mind